Oké. Beste IBT-docenten uit Nederland, politietrainers en first responder trainers. Vandaag een gesprek met Brian Willis. Een van de meest, wat mij betreft, gewaardeerde en belezen politie-educators in Amerika. Met een geweldige site, Excellence Training Academy, met heel veel podcasten, met heel veel audio-opnames, een jarenlange ervaring. Nou, je kunt zijn blog lezen. En in deze videoblog gaan we nog wat dieper in op de stukjes, op de onderwerpen die Brian in zijn blog heeft geschreven. Ik weet zeker dat je er heel veel van kunt leren. So Brian, did it sound like German or like Swedish or Danish?
Sounded Dutch to me.
Dutch, okay, that's great. Well, you wrote a blog for me, and then we talked. It's nice to go to some points out the blog, the written piece. Thank you very much again. And but before we go into the topics, I would like to inspire my colleagues with some other questions. And the first question is, and I know it's very hard for you to do as a host of my own podcast and so on, but from which 3 podcast episodes of your own podcast, Excellence Training Academy, have you learned the most in the last years?
In the last few years, and again, it's very difficult because I've done now well over 420 interviews. A lot of the learning for me takes place in the preparation, as you know. But if I was to boil it down to 3, I guess the first one would be a cluster of interviews. So Paul Taylor, who is a former police officer in Colorado, is a professor at the University of Colorado in Denver and has done a lot of research specific to the law enforcement profession. I've done 6 or 7 interviews over the years with Paul. In the last few years, probably the ones that have had the most impact are when we talked about human error. So in episode 272, we talked about to err is human, understanding and investigating human error. And that for me was very helpful to understand this whole concept of human error and how we investigate human error. And as a result, I now talk about that information in the Excellence in Training courses and in the Dare to Be Great leadership workshops that I teach, because we need to think differently about human error rather than, because we have this bad habit of blaming. And Sidney Decker, one of the experts in the world on human error, says that you can blame or you can learn, but you can't do both. We historically have a culture of blaming the officer. And as a result, there's little or no learning that takes place. What we need to do is look at what is there in this that there might be in the systems, the training or lack of training or the preparation for this officer. What piece of this do we as an organization, do we as trainers own? Right. And so I did the interview with Paul about human error, and then the 2 follow-up ones after that were about creating decision-making, or how do we build better decision makers, and how do we build resilience for error into our tactics and into our training. One of the other ones, there's 2 interviews with Gabrielle Salfati. So interviews number 287 and 325. Gabrielle is a professor of psychology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. And those 2 interviews were about stress, burnout, and resilience in law enforcement. And the second one was about the role of trainers and frontline supervisors in preventing and mitigating burnout. So burnout is a massive issue around the world in all organizations, and is certainly a big issue in ours. In fact, it's such a massive issue that the World Health Organization back in 2019 put it in their Handbook of Diseases manual and identified it as a workplace issue. And what I really like about the way that Gabrielle talks about it is she says that stress is operational, burnout is organizational. So stress is operational, burnout is organizational. And the reason I like that split and that definition is that if we can accept that burnout is organizational, then the antidote and the cure to burnout is great leadership and great culture. So if we focus on great leadership and great culture, training being a big part of great culture, then we can address the burnout piece. So it's something that is within our control, and there's things that absolutely we can do to address that. So that really was a big revelation for me. And again, that's something I now talk about in my leadership programs. And then the third one, and this is not meant to blow smoke up for you, but the interview with you where we talked about police trainer education or police teacher education and development, the Netherlands model, because there's a big push in North America right now that around police reform, and we need to do something different with our training. And I think great training starts with great trainers. And what we need to look at is developing great trainers. And so rather than just telling people, well, we need to do a better job of training our trainers, we need to have a model. What would be something that we could look at that is the ideal or the gold standard or something? And I think that's what you have with this police teacher model, where it's a full-time program for 12 to 14 months to develop a complete teacher for police, which is something that I don't know if anybody's doing that in North America right now. And we're certainly not making that investment. So I think that was a real insightful interview for me to give me a framework around where we could maybe start looking to go. Ultimately, it's going to take a long time to get there. But then also you provided insights on the training for police officers in the Netherlands. And again, I think that's something that we can learn from some of those models where I think you're way ahead of us in some of those areas. So I think those would be the three from the past few years that really kind of jump out at me. And again, there's so many great ones in there.
Yeah.
For anybody who I didn't mention, I apologize, but those would be three.
Great, thank you. It sounds incredible, especially the human error part. I came to the human error part because of my work for the emergency medicine.
Right.
Where they have, by the way, a great concept, safety 2. I don't know if you heard about it.
I've heard a little bit about it through Dan Dworkis's podcast with the Safety 2 model, But it's something I need to look into a little more.
Yeah, it's great because also recently I was at a human aviation, where they teach pilots and so on, and I talked with the psychologist over there, and they also talked about safety too. And I think it's exactly what you said. It's going from blaming to learning.
Yes.
It's very interesting.
And I think there's some of those professions like medicine and aviation that are way ahead of us. Mining, I think, is another one. Again, listening to some of the people on Dan Dworkis's Emergency Mine podcast, that there's some of these professions that are way ahead of us in this area that we need to learn from them and shift our approach to human error based on what other professions have learned. So absolutely.
Great. And the second question, and I know that it's not that I can answer it myself immediately, but I'm always looking for, because you talked about it in your blog, that a lot of trainers, they want to change and they know it can be done better, but they have to play within the how do you say it, conditions of the game.
Right.
But what are concrete steps that current and next generation police trainers can take today in the most broader sense of the word, to deliver better training? So what can my colleagues just start to do tomorrow to become better trainers?
So I think the first thing is we need to educate ourselves. So we need to read more, we need to explore more, and again, outside the profession. So what is it that they're doing in these other professions, in emergency medicine and in aviation and in mining and some of these other professions? What are they doing in the world of coaching? But we need to educate ourselves. And so we need to read more and listen to podcasts like what you do and follow your work and the work of many others. And we need to attend conferences. So you talked about, a Safety 2 conference or conferences on education, but there's a lot of trainers conferences around that are focused on law enforcement training. There's a number, I believe, over in Europe. The International Law Enforcement Educators and Trainers Association is the big one in North America, and we certainly have an international contingent there. But we need to get out and start to read and understand some of the information around learning and around teaching. So how do humans effectively learn? not just from a motor learning perspective, but the motor learning is important. So skill acquisition, skill adaptation, how do we address that? But also how do we learn the information? And then how do we start to apply some of this? So I think we need to get out and more and start to look at what information is out there. We need to come at it with an open mind, but a strong filter. So an open mind means I need to be open to new information, but I also need to put that information through these filters, because I've been to presentations, seen information online that, people are putting this out there. And when you look at it and take a step back and say, is it in alignment, congruent with the research on learning and the realities of stress and the effects of stress on learning and other things? It's not. So we need to have that filter to put that through. And is this applicable, and how is it applicable? Because a lot of the information is not done with law enforcement for law enforcement. I think we're doing a better job of that. You interviewed Bill Lewinsky recently in Force Science, and a lot of the people that they're affiliated with have done a great job of doing police-specific, law enforcement-specific research. But there's a whole body of research out there involving humans. And that's why when we talk about things like human factors, these are human factors. They're not cop factors. All humans are subject to this. And so what does the research from all these domains say? So first of all, I think we need to educate ourselves. And then what we need to do is look for examples and find people that have implemented some of these strategies. And again, it doesn't have to be in our domain. If we can find those, great. So, because I can look at the research. So I can look at the research, say, on learning and education, and say, well, the keys to make learning stick is we need to engage in reflection and active or effortful retrieval, and we need to have spaced practice or spaced repetition, and we need to have desirable difficulties, and we need to incorporate interleaving. But if I don't know what that means, if I don't know how to do that, it's useless information, or it's of limited use. So I need to find people that can say, here's how you do it in simple, effective ways. Here's how you can do it in small chunks within the box world that you live in, within the constraints that you have. Here's how you can do it. Things like ecological dynamics. There are places like the Netherlands that have been doing that in law enforcement training for a long time. It's not common in North America, but what we're seeing now is more people in the realm of sports. So martial artists, we're seeing sauders that are having a tremendous influence in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world in implementing that, and other people like Scott Seaverite and others that are weaving it into MMA training and a whole range. And there's a couple of podcasts, martial arts podcasts, that are just basically about ecological dynamics in the martial arts. So we can start to look to these other people and look at how they're doing that, and then start to apply it. We can reach out to some of these coaches, so I've interviewed whitewater canoe coach, Division I college volleyball coach, and other people that are doing this. I've interviewed people that work with NFL athletes and other people that are incorporating these. So that's where we need to reach out and then figure out what are other people doing. When we look at some of that research in North America, there's an academy in Oregon. So the state of Oregon is somewhat unique in North America in that there is one basic academy for the entire state. So every law enforcement officer goes through what they call DPSST, which stands for Department of Public Safety Standards and Training Academy in Salem, Oregon. And so a few years ago, they revamped their entire curriculum to make it evidence-based and research informed and apply these principles. So, and they're very good. I've interviewed Stacy Utsey, who is now the director of training there, who was the head curriculum design person during this evolution. And I've interviewed a number of people from different areas to talk about how they're applying it in their firearms, how they're applying it in their scenario training, how they're applying it in their physical education training. So there's people out there that are doing this that we can find some of that. And listening to Tim Ferris interviewed on the Andrew Huberman podcast a little while ago, Tim Ferris was asked, how do you seem to like see around corners and see into the future? What he said is, he said, one of the things that he said is, I look to the practitioners. What are the great coaches and the practitioners doing? Because they're going to be well ahead of the papers. So when great coaches and practitioners are having success with something, they're probably going to be 3 to 5 years ahead of the randomized controlled trials and the papers in that area. So don't just look to the papers, look to what the great practitioners are doing. And then the last thing I would say is, ask yourself, where might the smallest change make the biggest difference? So what can I do within my circle of control and my circle of influence to start to apply this in small chunks and small pieces, to test it, to assess it, and then to iterate and make it better if I need to, but just start to make small changes. You don't have to change your entire curriculum. That's going to be very difficult to do and very rare that anybody has the ability to do that. But regardless of what restrictions I have, there's things that I can do to start to apply some of this and then to start to build on it. So those would be the 3 things that I would start with.
Well, great. So to summarize, to educate yourself and to go to other disciplines, look for organizations and people who already do new stuff, better stuff, and also make small changes with big results. What was your beautiful sentence?
Where might the smallest change make the biggest difference? And that's a question I borrowed from Dr. Robert Cooper, a neuroscientist. So
that's great, because the last one I think is very important, because I think that most of my colleagues, but also myself as a teacher at physical education, applied university, we have a kind of feeling that we are stuck in this format and that we have no autonomy and the constraints are there. So, well, let's go on routine mode. But I think if you can make small changes, even within the silos, even within the constraints, then I think it gives a kind of autonomy and empowering.
Yes. And then you can continue to build on that. So even within those constraints, there's a lot you can do to implement some of these strategies. Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. We have 5 minutes for the last question. Then we have to make a, what do you call it? A cut. And this is a very difficult one again, of course, because I know you like to read a lot, also like me. So if you had to name a book or podcast or video that all police trainers, but let's give it a little twist, that all new police trainers, so the men and women who start their careers, which book, podcast, or video should they read or listen to or watch tomorrow? So,
all right. Well, I'm going to cheat and give you 2 books. And the first one is Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. So Peter Brown is the lead author, and Rudiger and McDaniels are the co-authors. Rudiger and McDaniels are both PhDs and 2 of the leading experts in North America, probably in the world, in the area of human memory. And they were very frustrated by the teaching strategies, the ineffective teaching strategies that professors were using at universities, and the ineffective study strategies that students were using. But they were very frustrated in their inability to get the message across. Peter Brown happens to be Rudiger's brother-in-law. Peter Brown was a writer by trade. And what he told them is, he said, if you give me the information, I can put it in a format that's easily understandable for people. So they pulled together all this research and he wrote the book. So I think it does a very good job of giving a foundation on the evidence and the research around learning and how we make learning stick. Because what we certainly here in North America, what we have historically done in training is we teach to the test. You pass the test in the academy, we tick the box, and we don't care about if you retain the information. And yet every field training officer that I've talked to, who gets a new recruit out of the academy, they've all had the same thought with those new recruits. Did they not teach you anything in the academy? And yes, they taught them a lot, but not in a way that lent itself to understanding, actual learning, retention, and the ability to recall and apply that information. So I think that book provides a great foundation for that. And then the second one I'm going to throw in is Do Hard Things by Steve Magness. And the reason for that is because one of the concerns I have, yep, absolutely, there it is, Do Hard Things by Steve Magness. One of the concerns I have is that there's still a lot of academies in North America that are built on this boot camp stress model, where if you look at stress exposure training as a scaffolding, a building, as we build people's competence and confidence and skills and abilities, we start to increase the complexity of the environments that they're going to function in to expose them to some of those elements. These models do that in reverse. They're stressing people out from the start. They're screaming, they're yelling, they're using physical activity as punishment, and as a result, turning people off from physical exercise. They're injuring recruits. In some cases, they're almost killing recruits because of the things that they're doing in some of these that are really almost hazing. Now, they do it under the false narrative of stress inoculation training, and under the false narrative that, well, people need to know how to perform under stress. And I agree that they do, but you need to give them the skills first. You can't put the test first and say, well, you flunked the test. So if you think of all of the university courses that you have taken over the years, if they gave you the test on the first day and they fail it, and then the professor said, you're an idiot, you'll never be any good in this profession, who would carry on? People would quit. Yes. And so they somehow feel that their job as trainers is to weed people out, and it's not. Their job is to train people. So Do Hard Things is about us rethinking this whole mindset of toughness.
Yes.
And when I didn't even make it through the foreword of the book before I reached out to him and said, this is right on the money from a law enforcement perspective. This is the challenges that we're facing. So I think those two in conjunction would give new trainers a great foundation to start with.
Well, great. I totally agree. And because we have 2 minutes left, I want to add another book which I have seen, which I have not seen in law enforcement, and that is How Training Really Works. It's from a German professor, and it's all about 12, I think she calls it that, 12 keys to training transfer. And this is such a great book because it takes a unique point of view, because they start from the concept of transfer. It's not about training goals even, because what are training goals? It are behavior goals in the real world, and then working back. And it's really, and do you know the book? Because it's so well written, and it's so, especially for trainers, like they have the keys metaphor, I think, 12 keys or 12 levers.
Okay.
And for each lever they give, like, it really changed my perspective on training. Like, so what if I reach a training goal? It doesn't mean a lot if it's not there 2 weeks after, and so on.
Yeah, if there's no retention, then there's no transfer. And so
Exactly.
it's a great philosophy about transfer. Does this transfer to the real world?
Yes.
And a lot of the training, there is no transfer. And again, the trainers are isolated, and they really don't care if there's transfer, because I can check that box, say you passed my course.
Yeah.
And then when you fail to perform out in the street at the level that I falsely expect you should, then I'm going to blame you, instead of me going back to that, how we look at human error, and asking, what piece of this do I own? So great recommendation. I haven't read it, but I will buy it right after we're finished our
And it's great because it gives really exercises like in a training. We have a half a minute, but one of the exercises is, she calls a transfer timeout, in which you say to the officers or to everyone, okay, think about 2 minutes about how you are going to do this in real practice, and also think about the obstacles you encounter, and you already get a mindset like, okay, so I have to do it. It's such a great book. I will send